Good evening and a very warm welcome from the Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute at the University of Pretoria. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Jolanda Steenkamp. I am a senior lecturer in the Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute and acting program lead for the Masters in Development Practice. I would like to take a moment to thank all our panelists, first of all, who will help us explore a very relevant topic tonight. Professor Stephan de Beer, Professor Yanni Higu, Mr. Lorenzo Davids, Mr. Carlos Mesquita, and Mr. Katleho Nape. And I will say a bit more about each of them as we proceed through the webinar. But here at the beginning, we are very grateful for your presence with us. Thank you for making yourselves available. And we look forward to a very fruitful discussion. I would also like to welcome the Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences, Professor Elsabe Loots, as well as the Director of the Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute, Professor Derek de Jong, and the Head of Department of Business Management at the University of Pretoria, Professor Alex Antonitis. I would also like to welcome Mr. Rais Yogi, who is the Operations Manager at the SDG Hub, which is also housed in the Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute. And then also a very warm welcome to the global community of the Masters in Development Practice program from the 37 universities across the globe. We extend you a warm South African welcome. There will be 3 Q&A sessions during this webinar because it is very important for us to engage with you. So please be sure to put your comments and questions down in the chat box. We will be hosting 3 of these webinars, one on multi-sector collaboration for malaria control and one on gender-based violence. These 2 will come later in the year. Today we are addressing the topic of street homelessness. So while the matter of social infrastructure and vulnerable communities are salient elements of both sustainability and policy reform, we also want to go beyond just focusing on the subject matter itself. We want to address and explore how leadership functions in addressing these challenges and thus implementing the SDGs. The role of leadership in addressing the SDGs is often under-researched, and in these webinars we aim to gather experts in their fields, in the various sustainability-related fields together in one room and inquire from them what they have learned regarding leadership as it relates to addressing some of the complex issues that we face globally. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Professor Stephan de Beer is the Director of the Center for Faith and Community and Associate Professor of Practical Theology at the University of Pretoria. His research foci include inclusive cities, homelessness, housing and spatial justice, and pedagogies for urban transformation. Recently, he launched the Unit for Street Homelessness in the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Pretoria as a commitment to ongoing engaged research, informing policies and practices addressing street homelessness, but also being informed by the lived experience of former homeless persons, practitioners, and activists. Before joining the University of Pretoria, Professor Stephan worked with the Tshwane Leadership Foundation an ecumenical community organization in the inner city of Pretoria, South Africa. And since 1993, the foundation has become an incubator for innovative and inclusive urban development and ministry programs. Among these, a social housing company, programs with women and girl children, homeless communities and inner city children, as well as a community festival and arts program. Stephan is part of initiatives that provide urban theological education and build networks of faith-based transformational urban leaders in African cities. He did his doctorate in practical theology on the role of the church in urban transformation, and a research doctorate in urban planning, focusing on the spirituality of urban space and the role and local communities in shaping future cities. Professor Stephan, it seems that you live out your career at the crossroads, traversing many boundaries to bring a truly transdisciplinary focus to the challenge of spatial justice. We are so grateful for your presence with us. Stephan is going to introduce the topic of leadership in transforming homelessness. Stephan, you're welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Yolandi, for this space. It's exciting. We always want to do stuff with Albert Luthuli Center for many years, and it's actually the first, I think, really concrete space like this, and so that's really exciting. Also, the panel, it's actually a panel of old and newer friends, so that's also great, because I think that's part of the thing is leadership as friendship is maybe something we're not going to talk about tonight, but I think that's an important aspect. So let me do that. I will introduce it, but I'll probably leave it to the panelists to speak more specifically about leadership. I want to put it in a context, and I want to start with reference to Leilani Faria. She was the former UN Special Rapporteur on Affordable Housing, and she made this statement saying, homelessness is a violation of human rights occurring in all countries, threatening the health and life of the most marginalized. Homelessness is the unacceptable result of states failing to implement the right to adequate housing. It requires urgent and immediate human rights responses by the international community and by all states. So our focus tonight is not necessarily on the 62% of African urban dwellers who live in informal settlements, but on the street homeless communities of South Africa who has no place to lay their heads. Or as the definition of street homelessness goes in Bangalore, India, people who live under the sky. And by way of introduction, I would simply like to make 10 statements. I don't want to do a PowerPoint, so right at the end, I will just screen the 10 statements for your benefit. Firstly, that homelessness is a violation of human rights, an offense to human dignity, and at a very deep level, a question of our common humanity, that we have to engage homelessness as such, ensuring the protection of rights, the sacredness of dignity, and the affirmation of humanity. Secondly, homelessness can be transformed. It is not inevitable because it is in many ways the result of structural, political, moral, and institutional failure and a symptom of the breakdown of community. It can be changed, and through solution-driven approaches, we can transform homelessness. Thirdly, homelessness is complex and cannot be solved through a one-size-fits-all approach. There are as many causes to homelessness as there are homeless people, and solutions need to be tailor-made in response to the causes that brought people to the street. Fourthly, the faces of homelessness in South Africa have changed significantly over the past 2 decades and is continuously changing. The majority of street homeless people today are young and unemployed, mostly men. It's symptomatic of South Africa's economic inequality, 3.5 million young people between 18 and 35 being unemployed, and the deep failures of the educational system, with roughly 50% of those who started primary school in 2009 never making it to grade 12 in 2020. There are more chronic homeless people than before, which are people who have lived on the streets constantly for more than a year or two, especially those who are older, or living with chronic mental illness or using substances in harmful ways. Student homelessness is a reality that was driven home much clearer than before since the Fees Must Fall protests of 2015. And Statistics South Africa in their last census showed a steady rise of street homelessness among people older than 55 years. The traditional family structure that absorbed older people have become fragile, and policies of deinstitutionalization mean no new institutions built to care for people falling through the cracks. And so the faces of homelessness are many and diverse, and solutions should be appropriate in accordance. 5, instead of blaming homeless people for their homelessness, we need to recognize the structural causes and our complicity as a society. The lack of affordable and diversified housing options, the lack of access to jobs, the lack of access to decent primary health care, the reality of mental illness going undiagnosed for many years, the breakdown of family and community, violence against people based on their gender or sexual orientation. You can hear the intersectionality of homelessness. Instead of dealing decisively with causes, we often blame those who are often victims, stigmatizing and criminalizing people to the point of certain municipalities even fining those who are homeless for being homeless, fining human beings for being human. 6, we have to interrogate our paradigms. In conversation with policymakers, we're often told all people have a home somewhere and they should simply return to where they came from. It makes me think, and maybe this is a crude comparison, but of the 1922 language of the Stollard Commission, which stated, and this is a famous horrible quote that you might know, the natives should only be allowed to enter urban areas which are essentially the white man's creation, when he's willing to enter and minister to the needs of the white man, and should then depart therefore or therefrom when he ceases so to minister. It seems as if we cannot escape the internalized apartheid consciousness that reduces some to objects, and when they are not useful to the dominant classes, they have to leave the city. Religious organizations, who are often at the forefront of work with homeless people, often require of people to jump through many hoops only to be able to access their services. And perhaps we have to interrogate our paradigms steeped in sobriety, abstinence, and compliance, asking how best to be companions on a journey in ways that are deeply respectful and empowering. The 7th statement, homelessness is at times a psychosocial issue, an issue of deep woundedness, but internationally it's increasingly recognized also as a public health issue. It is clearly a housing issue, in spite of the Department of Human Settlements not having it clearly on its agenda. It is an economic and educational issue. And solutions to homelessness need to be designed in ways that will address these issues in integrated ways. 8th, solutions and practices that have proven to facilitate sustainable pathways out of homelessness need to inform policies and strategies, both at local, provincial, and national levels. Only 2 provinces in South Africa currently have policies on homelessness, and only 3 cities. Nationally, it is still debated who should be the lead department, and a massive policy vacuum exists, which then allows for Treasury to not invest in reversing trends of street homelessness. Solutions and practices that work, and they are, need to be replicated and scaled through investment and not charity. The 9th statement, in cities where there were good and solid, broad-based, collaborative, centralized, and in-time coordination of homeless interventions during COVID, in some instances, we saw rather miraculous impact during hard lockdown. Various sectors needing to bring to the table their own strengths in synergetic ways, government as custodian of well-considered policy, strategies, and budgets, civil societies, including non-profits and faith-based groups, to be allowed to do what it does best, and the research community serving the process continuously through evidence-based documentation and in-time generation of data. The final statement, homeless responses, sadly, are often uncritical, unimaginative, and uncreative. To turn the tide on street homelessness, we have to be self-critical, and I speak of leadership, of everything we do to ask whether it in fact has the desired impact. We have to become imaginative in the solutions we generate and innovative in how we implement them. Homeless and former homeless people have to be in the room at all times to call out that which simply do not work at best or is patronizing and oppressive at worst. It is really a matter of a different kind of leadership. In the city of Tshwane, we created policy in 2015. It was only adopted in 2019. Questions could be asked. And then with no budget to it. COVID-19 assisted in enabling us to operationalize the policy. And in 20 days, 25 temporary shelters opened up, serving 2,000 people, 12,000 health screenings were done, 500 people received opiate replacement therapy. Chronic illness were diagnosed that people never knew they lived with, and those on chronic medication were able to adhere because of safe shelter and nutritious food. All this was held together by a daily operational center known as the Tshwane Homelessness Task Team and backed up by ongoing research and data generation. It soon became clear if there was sufficient political and moral will and an outpouring of kindness from ordinary people in the city, backed with in-time data gathering and research and collaboration by all sectors, one can almost overnight transform homelessness. The greatest danger of COVID, in some ways, for the homeless community, is not necessarily that it will kill hundreds of homeless persons, but that the gains we made in some places during COVID will not be sustained. The greatest fear many homeless persons I spoke to had was not primarily for COVID, but that the temporary housing they found during hard lockdown would be closed down. Provincially, for the first time in history, Gauteng has a draft policy, and the province of Gauteng, for those who are from outside the country, and they're rolling out budgets for homeless programs. Nationally, there is a new possibility of a conversation with a policy unit in the presidency to stimulate a national policy conversation to end street homelessness. Globally, we are slowly connected to partners in different cities to learn from each other, to urge each other on, as we seek lasting alternatives as a commitment to our common humanity. Homelessness is indeed a mirror to our society. When we look in the mirror, what do we see? Our first video clip before Yolandi will lead us into the panel is a short 4-minute reflection, simply titled Challenges and Innovations in the South African Context. And you'll hear two voices of people that have emerged in the last couple of years and months as important voices in the evolving conversation on street homelessness as a rights-based challenge in the South African context.
News, let me just commend all the NGOs across South Africa for doing exceptional work in extremely difficult and uncertain times. You have done the best that you could under the circumstances. We knew that the government didn't have the plan, and for the first time in a very long time, the government relied on the NGOs to do the work. And what is commendable is the fact that the NGOs, for the first time in a very long time, could come together, could collaborate, and establish these networks and really do the best that they could under extremely difficult circumstances. And the government was definitely reliant on NGOs.
The response in Durban was remarkably quick and remarkably efficient. And that was because we already had in place a forum in which the key players were talking to each other, were learning to work together and building trust with each other. That means the municipality, NGOs, academics, corporates, and faith-based organizations. This was a group called the eThekwini Task Team on Homelessness. It had been set up by the previous deputy mayor about 2 years ago, not with a lot of energy under her, but had gained a lot more energy under the new deputy mayor, Belinda Scott, who came into office September of last year. So when this announcement was made, I think it was a Monday evening, by 6 o'clock the next morning, the deputy mayor was on the phone to me saying, let's get the task team assembled so we can work out how we can deliver emergency shelters. And between Tuesday morning and Friday evening, when the lockdown began, we managed to put together emergency shelters for 1,500 people in central Durban, separating men from women and separating those who were elderly, sick or disabled from the general group. And it was possible to do that so quickly because effectively we had the combination of the expertise and the speediness of the NGOs, but also, to be fair, the resources and the money of the municipality. And that was really possible because the deputy mayor decided to give this, make it a major political priority and put her personal weight behind it. A colleague of mine, a homeless colleague of mine on the task team, made the comment that we achieved in 3 days more than we'd achieved in the previous 3 years. Durban already has a very strong collaborative spirit between the different NGOs. So rather than the NGOs competing with each other to work on this, we were all working very collaboratively, one focusing on healthcare, one focusing on food, things which certainly helped me through this whole period of lockdown and has helped our work in Durban, has been part of a national homeless network. This was a network that we set up almost 3 years ago and has mostly been some informal conversations and an annual meeting. But because we had that group of people, again, already connected, during lockdown, we met virtually once a week, and it was a chance for us to sound off with each other, which is always useful, to hear what was going on in other cities, to learn from each other. And for example, in KZN, we built better links with both Richards Bay and Pietermaritzburg, who were having similar problems, obviously not so far from us, and we were able to reach out and help them. So having a network of people who knew each other, who could build trust with each other and could share information, proved to be a really useful part of this whole strategy.
We are very reactive. We are not very proactive in terms of our responses. So when COVID hit, it was a chaotic situation. There was no national clarity, for example, on policy that deals with the disaster management in relation to homeless people. That was clearly lacking. And if you look back at the fact that government doesn't actually support the work of NGOs in the sector, I mean, it was very clear through the Nkatalo processes that these people work in silos. You know, they do the best that they can with what they know and what they have and the donations that they receive. But there's no coordination. There's no collaboration between the NGOs and between the government. And what I found very disappointed about is the fact that someone, for example, mentioned about there was a shared vision and a shared purpose. That shouldn't be the exception. That should be the rule. You know, there should be a shared vision and a shared purpose, irrespective of whether or not COVID-19 is present or not. And I really hope that going forward, that would be, in fact, the way that NGOs and government would work together to have a shared vision and a shared purpose in dealing with the crisis of homelessness within South Africa.
Thank you for putting together that insightful video, Professor. We're now going to move on to our first panel member. Let me introduce Mr. Katleho Ngape then, who is the head of the vulnerable programs within PEN. PEN stands for Participate, Envision, Navigate, and it is a community-focused, faith-based organization in Pretoria. Mr. Ngape has gained experience in working with the destitute and vulnerable homeless people for over the past 10 years. He is also a pastor of the Arcadia Community Church and also part of the Homeless Forum Executive. Mr. Ngape is going to address us on how we might relearn leadership. That's something that is very important, I think, and organizational and personal challenges in finding collaborative leadership forms. Mr. Ngape, thank you for joining us. We're so excited to hear the perspectives that you bring. Thank you also for being willing to jump in at this point. Thank you.
Okay, I was just saying thank you very much for inviting us. It's a privilege really to be part of this team. I think Professor Stephan de Beer already spoke about the complexity of homelessness. And over the years, we, as the NGO, we have learned lessons that in order for us to do justice to homeless people or vulnerable or destitute people, we need to do it with a holistic mind. We mustn't do the hit and run that we normally did, that we learned from, in a sense of any services that we render to homeless people. We must critically look at whether are they perpetuating dependency or are they creating what we call interdependency, in a sense of we don't always give homeless people fish, but we give them tools to fish, and we make sure that there is a river where they can fish. So we learned lessons as leadership, in a sense of saying, you cannot do this alone. We need to collaborate with other NGOs that are dealing with the same space. And we learned lessons, because when we don't do mapping in a sense of saving homeless people in Sunnyside or Arcadia, and if I don't do mapping and know people who are around me, or either churches, any stakeholder that is engaging in helping homeless people, you'll find that we are duplicating services, and those services are not actually helping our beneficiaries. For an example, if there is a person next door giving food and there's another one within 2 kilometers giving food, actually they are not helping homeless people to find pathways out of homelessness. They will have a timetable, waking up in the morning knowing that from 7 o'clock I'll get tea from this church until 6 p.m. they will be moving around getting food, and that is not the solution for them. But if we create spaces of empowerment in terms of looking at the facilities that we use, and try to create spaces where homeless people can be, there will be a sense of screening, and also when they are screened, and also there will be a place where we build different ecosystems, because when you build different ecosystems for different homeless people, because homeless people are not the same, and we mustn't approach them with the same mind. We have different faces. We have migrant laborers, people who are homeless. We call them homeless, but they are not homeless. It's only that they are destitute. That's why I put the word destitute there. They are migrant laborers. They are doing odd jobs, but they cannot afford accommodation, because accommodation is expensive. Therefore, they need a space where they can shower and get ready for work. And they also need a place where they can sleep and not worry about how would they go to work while they did not sleep well. That's why most of them will find out that they get jobs, but they lose them because they cannot function well when they go back to work. So we created spaces like that, but as well, I think the table of engagement with other NGOs, as I said, I'm part of the Tshwane Homeless Forum, looking at each other to say, we are not competing, looking at each other's strengths, because that's the thing in terms of leadership. If we don't look at each other's strengths and make sure that we don't compete, if you are excellent in family reunification and you have been doing it for long and you have experience in that, why should I stress about family reunification instead of bringing you with your leadership and your skills to assist us in terms of family reunification, and we can focus on IDP, which is an individual development plan of our homeless people, instead of focusing on family reunification, because it's not all the case that family reunification is the right way of doing things, because not everyone needs to go back home. Others came here to look for greener pastures, so they just need a place where they can be empowered. And as you said, the issue of collaboration, I said it helps us a lot in terms of also helping, because our beneficiaries, our clients, you cannot be homeless and not learn the art of hustling. When I talk about the word hustling, they hustle systems. If systems are created, they know how to hustle systems for survival. And sometimes you find that those systems are not helping them to get out of homelessness, but they are keeping them prisoners for long. And we will always pat ourselves on the back and say we are doing a great job. But you find that if we don't look critically on what we do and also hold each other accountable as NGOs to say, I know you are doing this, but what is the intake and the exit plan for your clients? You cannot just intake them and then there's no exit plan in mind. And also engaging with our government also to try to tell them that we are the extended hand. We need them to come to the table so that we can work together in terms of alleviating homelessness or street homelessness. So that's what I can just contribute from my side in terms of the experience that we have learned, to say we are also working, in terms of the recyclers that we have, those people are contributing to our economy. They just need an overnight shelter where they can sleep. Tomorrow morning they go and hustle without stressing about rain and somebody stealing their trolley. So we're looking at that. So when we are together, we can find solutions to this. And we mustn't also I would say the last word in a sense of saying, when we engage with homelessness, it always changes. And we learned with COVID that in 2020, we are now exposed to what we call semi-homelessness. And I know it's a new thing because we have people who are just waiting to pay rent. And those people are they cannot even afford food. And you find that they are coming to our centers while they are just surviving to pay rent because they don't want to be homeless. And in a sense, you find that they are also homeless. We have students that, education system will say we paid for their NSFAS. And you find that NSFAS is paying for other things, but not accommodation. We have students that are staying in our shelters now because they cannot afford accommodation. They are writing exams with us at the shelter, and they are now mixed with people who are homeless. But with them is the issue of saying they cannot afford accommodation, they are just homeless. So we need to look at this holistically and say, how can we do this better and learn from others? So thank you very much. That will be my contribution.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nape. It is wonderful to listen to you, and also to Professor de Beer, because you managed to put a human face to this topic when you address the specific challenges that they face, the problem of not getting enough sleep for work, or worrying that someone will steal their trolleys. And this is something that we so often stereotype as though homelessness is one thing. So thank you for putting that human face on the subject matter. I've learned that Mr. Mesquita is back, so we will listen to him in a second, but we're first going to watch another video which addresses one example of a response to COVID-19 in the city of Tshwane as it relates to street homelessness. Enjoy.
My name is Ngape. I'm one of the 10 pastors. We are at one of our drop-in center called Bethesda. It's not a shelter as such. We're calling it a drop-in center because it's a place where vulnerable people would come to get services. We have 3 shower facilities. You can have a locker where you can put your stuff. We have a space where guys can come and do laundry, so that when they go for interviews, at least they look dignified. We have sessions with our social workers. Some of the discussions that are happening here, it's those important things that make some of the people to be homeless. In a nutshell, we are a center that don't want to perpetuate dependence. Winter season, we have a program that we call LEAD, L-I-D, meaning Living in Discipleship Program. We normally choose guys that have showed their volition. They will come here and help assist us with garden. We literally accommodate them until the 31st of August. Since now people need to be locked down somewhere, we decided to say, okay, since we have been doing LEAD program, let's now put 12 bunk beds for those guys. We have one of our guys who was also part of the leaders here, the shelter that we have at Fair. He's now one of the leaders there. So he's on that side helping our elderly that are accommodated at Arcadia. That for me, it shows our philosophy of moving to interdependency.
My name is Tshwane. I started volunteering actually for the place because I was quite touched with what they were doing. So I think God is helping me miraculously.
I just want to thank all the churches that are busy helping Bethesda. This doesn't end here. We'll continue serving our vulnerable community. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you also to Penn for making this video available. We will move on then to our first Q&A session, and we invite everyone to post your questions in the chat. Let me see, we have a comment, such an inspirational video. Thanks for your commitment, Katleo. Yes, I agree. And there's a question, Katleo, if there are any volunteer opportunities available. I wonder if we can perhaps make some information available in the chat box, Katleo, if you don't mind. I think people will be able or will be interested in that. And then perhaps one question, and if I can address this question to Professor de Beer. Stephan, you said that homelessness is a challenge to our common humanity. You also said that it is a way of looking in the mirror. Street homelessness and the extent of street homelessness in South Africa is a way of looking in the mirror. So my question would be, does this say something about the way that we perceive our human nature, and that is important? Perhaps a bit of a critique against a critique of individualism, and that we lose something of the relational nature of our existence, and the importance of existing in community when we are a society that has such high levels of street homelessness.
Definitely, I think you said it, Yolandi. I mean, I can't say it better, except that we are, yes, we are very individualistic. We are, and especially in South Africa, we're a society of walls. We have demolished the apartheid legislation, but in a sense, we've replaced it with new kinds of walls and barriers. An interesting thing, for example, in Gauteng, which is not directly related to street homelessness, but the Gauteng City Region Observatory did a survey of Black and white people in Gauteng to consider whether the Influx Control Act should be brought back because there are too many people in Gauteng. And 33% of white people said yes, and 35% of Black people said yes, the influx control legislation should be brought back. So it's like so deep in our psyches. And we look for people to blame and to scapegoat. And often those who are most vulnerable present themselves then as almost handy victims that we stigmatize and criminalize. And therefore, I think that emphasis of mine on can we foster different paradigms where we really understand ourselves as part of one common humanity, and there's not a single person then as part of that should be excluded. And if that's our point of departure also as leaders, what will leadership look like? What will practices look like? What will policies look like? What will our languages look like when we speak about issues of who are homeless and who's not homeless? So yeah, I think it is a different point of departure that I would want to urge us to consider.
Would you say then that one of the requirements of leadership as it relates to this complex issue is the ability to read society against the grain?
To just say that again, Yolanda?
To read against the grain of the accepted values of society.
Yeah, and I think if like in your program, which is about development practice and leadership in development practice, I think that should be part of the kind of tools that we need to develop, the ability to read the society, to read the dominant narratives, to be able to name narratives that we all bought into that are actually often very oppressive. Just the whole notion of profit over people. And so the value we attach to certain pieces of land arbitrarily, whilst we don't attach the same kind of value to human beings. I think those kinds of things we must read and we must reflect. So I think one of the most important things for people that are in development practice is to be able to be reflective practitioners that will refuse to just do the same thing day in and day out, but that will be very self-critical about how we do what we do. And ask deep questions and allow those that we are engaged with to be the ones that correct us, to be our partners, our friends, and actually the ones leading us to new places. Those of us with the masters and the doctorates and all these titles need to be stripped of a whole range of things that we think we know if we want to be useful in small ways. And I think for me, that is very a real prerequisite for the kind of leadership that we need to speak about in the context of street homelessness. If we're not willing to be stripped of everything we think we knew and all our certainties to start to learn from scratch, I think we won't be very useful, if that's the right word, but yeah.
Thank you very much, Stephan. I'm tempted to ask another question, but let me go to the chat. There's a question. Nomonde says that I heard something interesting in an interview where a person working with homeless people asserted that homelessness in South Africa impacts men to a greater extent than women. In your opinion, is this correct? How are homeless experiences gendered? So I think this relates to a comment that you made, Stephan, about the majority of homeless people being male. But I think I'm going to ask Mr. Ngape if we could have your response to this question. How would you say that homeless experiences in South Africa are gendered? And what is the complexity around this? Can we say that because most of the homeless people are male, that it is a male problem or a masculine problem, or are there more dimensions to this issue?
Thank you very much. My response to this question is that there's more dimension. It's not male dominated because with women, with ladies, we have a program that works with vulnerable homeless women, but we've realized that over the years that with women, they can, stay in a flat as long as they are men even using their body just to not be homeless. So we have a lot of people who are semi-homeless while staying in the flats. They just, it's just that you don't see them because they are not women of the night or people who are, I don't want to really call them prostitute, but ladies that are standing on the street doing it. But they are in the flats, but it doesn't mean that they are not homeless. If you hear the story, you realize that they are homeless. It's just that they are doing exchange to keep themselves accommodated.
Do you have anything to add to that, Professor De Beer? Thank you very much, Mr. Ngapo.
We saw an interesting thing in the last months, and we don't know yet exactly how to explain it, and that is that suddenly there is a new reality of actually a lack of space in housing programs for women. And that's really since the start of lockdown last year, at least in Tshwane. I don't know what it's like in other cities. So we found that to be a reality, whereas the programs that traditionally were set up to support homeless women, I think also part of that reality is that many of for example, provincial government forced some homeless shelters to be turned into shelters specifically for gender-based violence. And as a result of that, which is also an interesting thing, because if you are a homeless woman, the chance of experiencing violence within a few days is very big. So instead of prevention, these shelters are actually kind of told if they want to continue to have funds, they should only focus narrowly on women who are victims that have proved that they have been victims of gender-based violence. And so there's a new challenge in terms of just space for women. But all the reasons for that, I think we need to delve deeper for what that reason is. The question, though, is gender, so it's not just women and men. I think one of the very important things that we seldom speak about is people who are part of the LGBTIQ+ community, and especially transgender people. If you are a person in that category that identify yourself as such, and you need accommodation, your struggle and the stigma you're going to experience is huge. So I think there's that layer that we need to take note of. In Kampala, for example, during lockdown, there is a specific facility, shelter, housing program for people from the LGBTIQ+ community, and police and citizens together actually attacked that specific shelter during lockdown, and really violently attacked the people that lived there. So I think when we think of gender, we shouldn't just think in terms of women, men, and in a heteronormative way. We should really have a sensitivity that we develop around people who are part of the LGBTIQ community.
Thank you, Professor De Beer, and thank you to both of you actually for your insights in this matter. I think we have time for one more question. Wilhelmine asks for comment on the following, And I'm going to open the floor to any of our panelists who wish to address this, because addressing this issue of street homelessness touches on such stigmatized issues such as substance abuse, mental illness, and trauma, while trying to empower the individual as well as focusing on relationship and community. It is very difficult trying to enforce structure, rules, or discipline in a humane way. And then I see Prof Yanni Hichu just commented here that, Wilhelmine, those people need first of all care, listening, and understanding. Structure and rules are developed with the person in joint decision making. Any other comments from our panelists?
I would say I think I spoke about the ecosystem of change. I agree with Prof. You don't create rules alone. Most of the rules we have in our organizations are created by the community because of the ecosystem of change that they see. It's not us sitting behind the desk and thinking the work that we do, it's messy. It's not comfortable. You can't want to be comfortable when you do this, which makes us to always want to change and to be relevant to the context.
Thank you very much, Katleo. I'm going to allow space for one more question. This is from Lucia Rodriguez. Lucia is the secretary of the MDP Global Association. First of all, Lucia, really nice to see you here. Thank you for joining us. And then the question she asks relates to youth. Are these homeless men and women part of the youth population? In short, is there a problem as well with homeless youth? Who wants to respond? Yes, go for it.
2019, we had just in our center, we had 4 teenagers with us in our shelter at Bethesda. So the video. So yes, but they are young people who are homeless, youth specifically. And I think the number is going to increase now with people coming to university, trying to get into universities and waiting for the NSFAS money. So there is youth, young people who are homeless. And when you go to other shelters like the Hub, they also have teen youth. We have a guy who's 19 years at our shelter as I speak.
Mr. Nape, can you just explain to our international viewers what the NFS funding is?
Oh, okay. Sorry, I forgot. It's the funding that students get from for them to study at the university or any university. So they get that funding, but it's only tailored specific for other things, whether it's for books, for them to be enrolled in the university. It doesn't cover everything in terms of accommodation. So it's the fund for the youth for them to be able to study.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Okay, I think let's close the Q&A session for now. There will be time for further questions later. Professor de Beer, can I ask you to introduce our next video, please?
Oh, okay. We're already with the third video. Sorry, yeah, Julia. I don't know if you would know the person in the third video, Roseanne Haggerty. She has done incredible work in New York City around homelessness. And she's also part of the Institute for Global Homelessness, which is a partner of some of us. And simply, the clip is simply called Homelessness is Solvable. And she gives suggestions of why she would say that.
Throughout the world, in countries rich and poor, tens of millions of people are struggling to survive on the street or in limbo and temporary shelters. Most people are familiar with the sight of homelessness and agonize over what's to be done. But homelessness is a solvable problem. I'm Roseanne Haggerty. I'm the president of Community Solutions. Homelessness is one of the most serious contributors to poor social outcomes. It undermines families' and individuals' health, their ability to maintain employment, children's ability to complete school. Long-term homelessness takes as much as 25 years off people's lives. What we're learning is the solution to homelessness is to reframe it as a public health challenge, not simply a problem of housing supply. And that requires a very different approach. The Built for Zero initiative is a national movement that involves 75 large cities and counties in the United States. and it's shifting the way communities understand the problem. First, a community has to understand that this can't be solved by a collection of individual program efforts. What is needed is what we call more of a command center approach. Everyone around the same table agreeing to share a single goal, which is zero homelessness. The next big shift is using by name real-time information. Each person, each family is experiencing something very different in the form of a housing crisis. And without knowing that information, it's almost impossible to permanently solve their situation. And then lastly, building housing or providing other resources in response to what your community's data is telling you is the specific problem. Communities like Rockford, Illinois and Jacksonville, Florida were early adopters of our Built for Zero initiative. They were willing to do the work of bringing together a community team that would operate above individual organizations. They have gone out and identified by name everyone experiencing homelessness in the community, and they match resources to the specific needs of individuals. They problem solve as a team on a weekly, if not daily basis, and that's changed the game in these two communities and many others. We now have 12 communities in the United States that have ended chronic or veteran homelessness. And what's striking is that communities have different resources, different cultures, but this different way of working is making the difference. Imagine a world where homelessness is rare, brief when it happens, and really gets fixed for those people to whom it happens the first time.
Thank you so much for that video. Okay, so what I will do is there are a few questions in the chat that we did not get to. So let's go to another Q&A session. And then Kanti asked, my comment is in relation to the voice of homeless people. How loud and listened to are they? Who is listening to them? With what interests and intentions, in view of the root cause of their unfortunate situation, which will then lead to solutions directly responsive to actual root causes. What type of leadership can actually pull all these facets together in a harmonized manner towards a desired state? Stephan, would you like to address this question?
Sure, I would actually love for Carlos and Lorenzo to come in on these, although they haven't spoken yet, but this is such an important question. I don't know if they want to come in now, otherwise I will respond.
Mr. Davids? Yes, please, if you...
Sorry, can you just frame that last part of the question for me again, and then I'll make a comment. Just,
yes,
is that the one in the chat there?
Yes, it's the one in the chat of who is listening to these people and responding to the root causes, and specifically this, what type of leadership can actually pull all these facets together in a harmonized manner towards a desired state?
Just a quick comment. I think there is a problem with listening. I do think that we have we developed such an intensity with what we've designed that we have a problem in listening. And bringing what we've designed and what people are saying together is part of the problematizing that we've encountered with this problem. So there's a problem on our side with listening to what people need, want, desire, and aspire to. And I think the issue of who's leading this is the second part of that struggle that we have to make sense of this ecosystem. Is it the church? Is it civil society? Is it government? Is it third sector groupings? Is it the NGOs? Is it a particular mandate that a certain sector of the community has? And so who's leading this? And I think that's exactly where the complexity lies, because part of not knowing who's leading it is exactly also understanding who is driving it financially, who's paying for it, who is putting their heads on the block to say, I stand on these things. There's a number of barriers to the leadership question. And so homeless people, people who live on the streets, or people without housing, or people who are vulnerable, often don't know who's actually the one they go to. You and I know if we have a problem, we go to person X because he's a doctor that specializes in that. We want to get into a university, we know where to go. There's a registrar that deals with that. If we want to get a pension, there's a SASSA office that does it. But in the sector, how do we make it easy for those who are the most vulnerable? So there it's a particular challenge that I think we have. We are not listening enough, and two, we have not clarified for those who are vulnerable, who's leading this.
Yes, thank you very much. It reminds me, what you're saying reminds me of what Stephan said a while ago about having to be willing to unlearn everything that we think we know. And I was tempted then to ask him, but who will be our teachers if we have to relearn? And I think that can be applied to the leadership question here. We often approach this problem with the idea that someone has to save people and we know what they need, but how about them being the leaders in teaching us what the real nature of the problem is, the structural issues that we need to take responsibility for fixing, that is not their problem to fix, and to really become students and followers in that respect, to really understand this problem well.
If we can get out of the way and be the true servants of the cause and not the leaders of the cause, we'll probably serve those who suffer and are the victims and have the hardships and the vulnerable. We'll serve them a lot better if we were just to lay down our halos and our leadership and engage the ecosystem as servants.
Can we address the problem of putting blame at the wrong place? This was also mentioned earlier, when there are structural problems, for instance, the economic situation in South Africa, our huge high level of unemployment, structural issues that lead to street homelessness. Are we focusing on the wrong problem? What can we do to move away from this blame culture and blaming and stigmatizing homeless people? When we generalize a problem, we think of homeless people and we immediately think, and there was a comment in this regard about substance abuse, we immediately stigmatize them, thinking that they're lazy or they don't want to work or whatever the problem is. At the moment that a human being is generalized like that, it's very, very easy to sweep them off the table because it's dehumanizing to generalize like that. So how can we bring the human face back in this problem, and then together with that, define leadership in terms of taking responsibility to address structural injustice? Who would like to address this question?
Could I just say one thing, Yolandi, and then others, Lorenzo and Carlos? I see Yanni is still not back. Just that, part of that should be who's in the room. It's so easy to stigmatize in spaces where all of us look the same and are the same, and there's nobody that can call us out. In the process of designing policy in Tshwane, there was, among other things, the culmination of research that was done was a summit where we were about 400 people. And one of the basic rules for the summit was that at least 50% of the participants should be people who either are homeless or were formerly homeless, because we also sense that the best people to help us understand what sustainable pathways out of homelessness would be are those who have been able to sustainably get out of homelessness and are really the experts of it. And so we had a really spectacularly wonderful time, round tables where people use that space very well as well. Now, that shouldn't be once off, of course, that must be ongoing. But I think those spaces must be deliberately designed. And I don't know if Lorenzo will touch on that. In Cape Town, they've recently been through a similar process, but processes where we are very deliberate about how we create the spaces so that it's not possible for us to speak about other people. And so that we can foster these new kinds of communities where those who are homeless and not homeless are in the same room and can have robust conversations with each other, because our language immediately starts to change, because we realize we're often just putting our feet in our mouths. So I think that will be for me a starting point. Is just how do we design this very deliberately all the time.
Thank you, Professor de Beer. Yes, I think our language changes, but I think our whole way of being human also becomes enriched. It's a very fundamental change. All right, thank you for your questions. We're going to move to our next panelist, who already answered one of the questions, Mr. Lorenzo Davids. Mr. Davids is the CEO of Community Chest South Africa, and a global leader in social development, who has worked for decades to tackle the root causes of poverty and improve the lives of the underserved. Lorenzo's work helps address the stark inequities left behind by apartheid South Africa. But since 2012, he has led Community Chest, a development organization that distributes millions of dollars a year to more than 600 nonprofit organizations across South Africa. The focus is on supporting education, health, and income generation. He's also part of a group of 12 people chosen from around the world by United Way Worldwide to form the Global CEO Development Program for nonprofit organizations. Over the course of his career, he's helped develop dozens of projects. Among them are residential facilities for street children, a center for victims and child abuse, a school for at-risk youth, a computer literacy center, a women's crisis center, and a hospice. Prior to his appointment at the Community Chest, he served as CEO in the City Mission in Cape Town for 14 years. He also founded Urban Issues Consulting, which focused on social development research and corporate social investment. In addition, he has held positions with the South African government and its Department of Education, and he is a founding board member of the Homelessness magazine, The Big Issue in Cape Town, and of the Crystal House South Africa, a school offering world-class education to children from impoverished communities. A graduate of the University of Cape Town, Lorenzo believes that the development efforts are most effective and sustainable when they focus on education. We are profoundly privileged to have you with us. Thank you so much. You have so much experience and knowledge to share. Please go ahead.
Thank you. It's very sad. I really love us at some point to get Carlos sorted out so that we can hear from Carlos and have his voice. His voice is a very important one in this conversation. So, but thank you for the introduction and thank you for hosting me. I'm going to be brief with my 10 minutes. The fundamental problem that I think we sit with, for me, as we've journeyed with dialogues around homelessness, is probably the one is I think we have to dispense with overly defining it. I think we've defined it almost ad infinitum, and the problem has not gotten any clearer because we've defined it a different way. And so I think the issue is that we get stuck on definition. And the plight that we have is that we sit with a particular development challenge where people don't have two fundamental things. The one in the video that we saw, one is housing, access to good housing, and the second is the fact that it's a public health challenge, that people don't have access to the services they need from a public health perspective, which is fundamental. And if you can't get access to housing and to appropriate healthcare services, the risk of you moving out of some kind of protective living environment is very, very real. The percentages, the risk factors, the percentages all go sky high because of those particular issues. We all have grown up with family members where that reality exists. People who have moved onto the streets because they've lost their home or because of a public health crisis, mental health, physical issues, loss of social support services have increased their vulnerability to housing on the streets. So besides the definition issue is the issue of language. I think, and so I'm addressing the issues of human rights and justice as a platform for engagement with homelessness. And I think the second issue for me is the issue of language. I think that for too long, the issue of language has been problematic for us. I'm not certain that we've got our language right, because part of the language you use has actually increased the problem that we are trying to solve. So by talking of homelessness and shelters and drop-in centers and integration programs and a host of other things, which are useful to have and useful to probably have as the background to all of this, our conversations with vulnerable people is not in the realm of a natural conversation anymore. They've all become clients, service users, and a host of other words we've put into that ecosystem that I think diminishes their capacity to engage as an empowered person. And so language becomes fundamental within that particular scope. I want to stop talking in my ecosystem of homelessness. I want to talk about the issues rather: housing, access to health, access to sanitation, people who don't have access to a roof over their heads, or appropriate bedding, or access to food. Let's define the issues far more critically and directly instead of the nebulous term of homelessness. Because if we don't define it, we will keep on grouping this mass of people, and they have individualized needs. They have individualized services. There are people who, as we all know, live and sleep on the streets, but they have brilliant jobs. They are great parents. They are great spouses. They're great partners. They are responsible citizens. They go and vote in an election. And so unless we begin to break this down into what people actually are there for, we keep using these mass words to group people together, and the problem is then attacked at its worst possible engagement, that they are all drug addicts, they are all abusers, they're all the negative stuff. And the large volume of positive stuff in that community gets washed away. It gets diminished because the language we use about this is problematic for me. I mean, take the issue of their capabilities. There's no way that we're adequately assessing their capabilities, that we are giving them the capacity to engage with us as adults or as young people, as capable individuals. There is an assumed incapacity, which is problematic. And so it deepens the crisis of trying to address this issue and trying to provide a way out, an answer to the particular individual crisis that we sit with. And so for me, that is problematic, because the human rights in Chapter 2 of the Constitution applies to all of us. It applies to those individuals as well who live and sleep without a proper housing infrastructure. The rights of safety and security, and the rights of housing, the rights of education applies to them as well. And it's so easy for us to push all those rights to the back of the line because we're dealing with all the other stuff first that have become problematic for us. And I'm saying, deal with people with the capacities that they hold. Don't keep on problematizing their existence, because if we keep problematizing their existence, that they're challenged to urbanization, they're challenged to housing communities, they're challenged to commerce, they're challenged to government, they're challenged to the Department of Social Development, it won't change. Nothing will change if we keep using language that problematizes this particular issue. I do also want to make a note that I have in the years that I've been around in the space, I have begun to have a sense of despair about the sort of graduation process we have for this cohort of our society. You know, there's always something they have to achieve to have access to. And if you understand what I mean, it's almost like there's this 12-week course they have to do. There's this 10-week program. There's this 6 things they have to complete. And I think in my life, that rigor does not exist. I come home and I cook a meal and I eat because I'm hungry. I might have done a great day's work, or I might have just kind of dealt with my problems, or had a day of thinking for myself and sat on a bench. The rigors of what we have to go through, to that cohort of society has to go through to prove themselves, for me, has become part of the problem. So everybody has this graduation system. Oh, they've completed 12 weeks, and oh, they've done a work program, and oh, they've cleaned the building, or they woke up at 7 o'clock on time and didn't oversleep. My good Lord, my children oversleep. And the rules we've built into our ecosystem for people to prove themselves at their weakest, at their most vulnerable, is almost insane for me. I want to go and say, I will hold you, hug you, and it doesn't matter if you fail 10 more times, but let's get going. I believe enough in you. That's what justice does. Justice is dispensed when we are at our weakest and somebody says, but you deserve this opportunity. It's your right to. It's this mixture of equity and justice and grace and mercy and love that all comes together, not in some clinical fashion, but in a way that demonstrates the power of our existence as human beings, as sojourners, as fellow human beings on this planet, to create a world in which people can feel they belong. And the global homeless community across the planet is one of the largest cohorts of people across the world. If they were to form a population, they'll probably be a country. And yet we keep treating them as if they are non-existent within our own worlds. We haven't found a way to use a different to stop defining them, to not use language that creates the sense that they are the worst of, and we've not found a way to dispense with this that they always have to prove themselves before they get the next reward in life. That's not true of me. I have so many things in my existence that I do not deserve, but I get it daily. The love of my family, the fact that I have a job, the fact that oh, by the way, I'm no longer the CEO of Community Church. I wanted to correct that in my CV in case my previous employer gets upset about that. I've just moved on to something else that I'm doing. But it's this notion that people always have to graduate from something to prove themselves. And I'm saying, I simply want them to feel like somebody believes in them enough to trust them, that even if they fail, I won't rip their bed from under them. I won't push them back to the back of the line. I will say, no, we're going to go on. I saw this wonderful quote this week. It's some meme that came out and just came across my desk. It says, Jesus knew Judas was in the room, but Judas also ate. Jesus knew Judas was in the room, but Judas also ate. There was a meal prepared for him as well. And how often haven't we dealt with vulnerable people as if they have to prove themselves, graduate through our systems, and then they get the right to see this. So I'm watching my time. So part of this, I've got one minute left. Part of what we have to do is to make sure that we ensure that homeless people who live in that cohort, who live in that ecosystem, stop feeling like we are defining their existence, that we are defining who they are, what they deserve. They have a constitution that promises them justice, and we have to have new paradigms about housing. They have the right to housing, new paradigms on training, not as a merit-based system where they get to access training. If they've done a few things, they have the right to be trained. It's an investment. Every child starts grade 1 and there's a right to start grade 1. Why are homeless people having to deserve to get to the training? Let's empower them, give them the knowledge, give them the information. They have a right to participate fully. They have a right to access. They have a right to ask questions. They have a right to services that are personal and individualized, not just group engagements. And they have a right to question the cost of development. They have a right to ask us serious questions about what it's costing. They have a right to engage with us on fundamental issues. So we have to turn the whole conversation around. And as Stephan said, and I've heard him say this many times, and I'm ending with this, they have to be in the center of the room, and they have to ask the questions of us. Thank you very much.
Ms. David, thank you so much. I think the point that you made about language is a very important one. It's so fascinating what language does. You know, when we discuss street homelessness, the phenomenon, then it's something that's over there that we can critique, and it's not something that is related to us. The moment we change the language and we start talking about listening, or we start talking about providing housing, then we are the subject of that verb, and suddenly we are involved. Such an important point. I would like to introduce our next panelist, Professor Yanni Yihu, who is the director of the University of Pretoria Community-Oriented Primary Care Research Unit. He is leading the academic development and implementation of this unit, including mobile data systems and the implementation of a community-oriented substance use program in collaboration with the city of Tshwane, that is the municipality around Pretoria. Some of our overseas visitors may be more familiar with that name, and the Gauteng, the province here, the Department of Health. He leads the University of Pretoria team in developing 2 population surveillance sites as part of the, and I'm going to have to ask you to explain this, Professor Yanni, GRT Inspire Saccharin node in Gauteng. Professor Yanni trained at the Free State University and practiced primary care in Kwakwa in the Free State from 1984 to 88 before moving to Medunsa, a medical university, and subsequently the University of Pretoria. Professor Yihu will address us on chaos, leadership, change, new ways of being and doing. Thank you, Professor Yihu.
Thank you. First of all, I assume you can hear me. That GRT Saccharin, this is a population surveillance program that I do surveillance of populations over a long period. And we've got 3 populations in Gauteng. One is an inner city, one in Hillbrow in Johannesburg, and then there are 2. The one is in a township in Atteridgeville in Tshwane, and the other is an informal settlement, a fast developing informal settlement called Malusi. So that's just explaining that. I have a healthy aversion of the term leadership, how it's often understood. So I feel a little bit hesitant to talk in a leadership environment about leadership when I think that it is often a concept that is misunderstood and often not used well. When we go into the informal settlements, we often are met by people who are called community leaders, but they're actually gatekeepers and they are looking after themselves. I don't want to comment on our leaders, but the point is, what I change now is to say that actually the homeless people are the leaders. But let me get to my topic of complexity and leadership. I must say, in my reading of complexity management, the concept of leadership came out quite strongly. So I have to concede that leadership is important. And I must say, when I think back about what we've done in COVID, when things had to be done, the leadership that emerged from several of us, and I include myself, was a very important part of what was achieved. For people who are in the business of leadership, I will, as I'm just a GP, I will say complexity is probably one of your basic sciences. So maybe what I tell you about complexity, you already know. But complexity actually says that organizations are unknowable and unpredictable. And that although they need leadership. And in the references, there are enough information, and also each of those articles have a lot of things there. But what is important for me about complexity, understanding life and organizations as complex, evolving, adapting systems, is that, first of all, everything is connected to everything. And by the way, if anybody ever wondered what complexity is, I'm sure during the pandemic, we now understand that life is not predictable. What I said before the pandemic, I sometimes used to say fairly flippantly that what's the use of a 5-year plan if the world changes in March? Now, 2020 showed us that. I'm actually quite scared to say that now because it's so true. The point is, everything is connected to everything. But what is useful is to say that it is not so much the nature of the elements or the parts of the system that's important, but actually the relationship between those parts. So if you focus on things, don't focus on the element or the person, but focus on the relationships between that, especially in terms of management. Now, in my first slide, I put up 4 things that is important in leadership and management in terms of complexity. And they are not in specific order, but it's communication, cooperation or collaboration, and innovation, and everything of that at speed. So in managing homelessness interventions, the first, communication is obvious. We need to talk to people and listen to people, but cooperation and collaboration, and you can define them differently, but it is so important. I'm nowadays in a frame of mind that if I'm busy with an endeavor and there's an absence of cooperation and collaboration, I either try to alert people to that and try to establish it, or I walk away. Now, there are so many elements involved in addressing homelessness that I want to say, if there's no collaboration or limited cooperation, don't go any further. Do that. And my approach to collaboration is hinging on 5 elements. The first one is respect, which is obvious. And it may not actually be trust, but at least respect. The second one is joint knowledge creation. That's what it's all about. We don't know life. We don't know what's going on, but together we build the knowledge so that we can take decisions, because you can only take decisions on information and knowledge. So that's the second point. The third point, I say it in the way to say the currency of collaboration is communication and not power. And this is something I want leaders to understand. The moment I pick up power issues in an endeavor or in a relationship, I stand back and push information. Because if you're busy with power games, you're not busy with cooperation and collaboration. And it's better to pick it up, understand, and push information. The fourth point is that you actually need to build systems so that things can happen. And the same with complexity. It happens within a system, within a specific area. The systems don't need to be in detail, but they need to be there. And then the last point of collaboration is that it's about effort. So if you pick up in an endeavor that if there's a big difference in effort, it needs to be addressed, because it's not something that happens without effort. So in terms of cooperation and collaboration, to me, that is the first thing that the manager and the leader need to look at and say, is that there? And if not, how can we grow that? The issue of innovation is actually happening if you look for emerging solutions. And that's where the leader needs to create the space within which the innovation can develop. And that means to also give space for solutions that are imperfect or not well defined yet. You also need to give space for innovations that emerge. And sometimes diversity needs to be there. So we have communication, collaboration, and cooperation and innovation at speed. And I think this is where leadership becomes important, because if you think of, I mean, most of us understand something about sport, rugby or soccer or whatever. Timing for impact is important. So if something needs to be done, then the leadership or the manager needs to be bold enough to say, it is now the time to do this thing if we want the impact. If you wait a little bit longer, it's fine, but the ball is not there to kick. And if you kick, you won't have the impact. And that to me is where leadership comes in, because somebody needs to take the responsibility for the uncertainty and the possibility of failure. And that's the leader. So you need to be prepared to say, okay, this is what's happening. Together we work out this thing. This is now necessary, but guys, it needs to happen tonight. And if not tonight, tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock or something. The point is timing is crucial.
Yes.
And the leader is the one that needs to check that. So if all of this is done, then you can go somewhere. Now, there's a slide on leadership there. And the literature in complexity leadership defines it as a humble leader. And why is the leader humble? Because you don't know. If you knew, you could have run a factory, but this is not a factory. So humble leadership is important. And secondly, creating space for new leaders. We saw it so clearly in this the COVID thing, how new leaders came up there, and also decentralized leadership. And then within that, give space for innovation, etc. There's a whole section in that PowerPoint of different things that you can do. Importance of connecting people, to identify a paradox and tension, explore that, don't run away from that, to look at emergence and let the direction develop, and a whole list of other things which is in the power.
Thank you. Mr. Carlos Mesquita is a founding member of the Homeless Action Committee that lobbies for the rights of the homeless. He is also the originator and conceptualizer of the Rehoming Collective, a non-profit organization whose purpose and intent is to rehome the homeless with dignity and in a way that their agency remains intact. Carlos has critical insight regarding the reality of street homelessness in South Africa and the plights many homeless individuals face. Mr. Mesquita will address the question of how society fails homeless communities, as well as how we might discover new paradigms in creating pathways out of homelessness. Mr. Mesquita, thank you for volunteering your time and sharing your expertise with us. You are most welcome. Thank you.
And thank you very much to you and to Professor de Beer. I'm going to be speaking on how society fails homeless communities and the discovering of new paradigms in making pathways out of homelessness. I don't know how many people know this, but I myself was homeless for 6 years, and actually only came out of homelessness with Tshwane. And so I'll be speaking very much as a person with lived experience of homelessness, despite the fact that I was in the sector for quite a number of years prior to becoming homeless. A number of things have happened since the pandemic started. And one of the good things about it is that the public became more aware of the situation that is homelessness. Prior to that, there wasn't much of a platform. People were fed the information from the powers that be, and that is basically what they believed. And I think that is what we're still sitting with, and I think it's one of the biggest challenges, is the fact that we have to convince the public about what is actually going on. For example, in Cape Town, we have a situation where, to a lot of other provinces will think we are privileged. We have quite a number of shelters. Unfortunately, the shelters space available compared to what the actual numbers of homeless people are on the streets, which the last count was 14,000, just over 14,000, and we've got 2,000 shelter spaces. And we have a city that, for example, promotes the Give Responsibly campaign, Give with Dignity, which I would, in any other circumstance, also agree with. But unfortunately, when you're in a situation like we have in Cape Town, until you've got spaces to accommodate all those homeless people, you cannot ask the public to give responsibly, because nobody's looking after the people that are on the streets. The funding that gets taken from Give Responsibly goes directly into one of the organization's accounts. And so the same 2,000 beds are being looked after in various ways, be it by the provincial government, by the city of Cape Town, as well as the public, and the rest get left behind. So educating the public about that particular issue is what our biggest challenge is at the moment, whilst we have got their attention on homelessness. A good percentage of the bed spaces that is required, with a clear conscience, to tell the public, okay, you can now give responsibly. I actually lost my space here. The other important aspect where society fails the homeless has to do with people becoming homeless in the first place. The myths around homelessness are plentiful, but if we look at the facts, the scenario is very different. Yes, drugs are prevalent in homelessness, but virtually all can be seen as a symptom rather than a cause. Even those that are already addicted when they come into homelessness became addicted because of whatever issues they were having, for example, being ostracized, being rejected by family, that type of thing. So they come into homelessness with an addiction, and so people tend to think, okay, they're all homeless people are addicts. I can speak from experience. I became addicted once I went onto the streets, because it was the only way that I could actually function and adjust myself to this new reality, which was not a reality for me at all. So you do get, that type of situation, and people have to become aware of these things. And I don't blame society, but we do need to use whatever platform we have in order to inform society about these things. You can't wish homelessness away. So in order to make inroads in reducing and ultimately eradicating homelessness, we have to ask the public, as well as everybody else that's concerned, to buy into and take ownership of this process. And ownership means that we will care and offer support rather than be judgmental and be in denial. When hard times can fall upon anyone, I'm proof of that. And it is the presence of support and compassion that will prevent those hard times turning into homelessness. Working towards and supporting the trend of those in office, which is basically for years They criminalize homelessness. I mean, in Cape Town at the moment, we've got a wonderful thing going on. And one of the reasons we are so blessed in getting the public opinion is that not only did we have a case as SHAC that we won against the city of Cape Town that brought up the issues that we have to deal with as homeless people, but also at the moment we've got, I think Professor de Beer mentioned, one of the speakers mentioned the people being fined for being homeless. That case is now going to court as well. There are 11 people that are suing the city of Cape Town, and there's an unheard of campaign behind that. I mean, it sounds like a pop campaign, the way they are marketing this case against the city. The current situation is basically, and I'm going to use the example of somebody that actually stayed at our house, which is an independent living space that we've opened in with the help of Community Chest for 6 months in Pretoria. And that is a young man that I have known since he arrived here in December, brought in by one of the service providers. And I've known him for about 10 years. He was 16 when he landed up on the streets. He decided to come out to his parents, and his parents rejected him because of his sexual orientation. And he landed up at a shelter in Cape Town where his phone and his bag were stolen by the second night. And so he'd heard about a place in Hope Street that gave out food. He went there, and there he met another young guy that told him, but you know what, there's easy money to be made in Hope Street. You can come, and the pedophiles, you know, take young boys, etc. And so this is what he did that first night, and he couldn't believe the money he had in his hands after that first encounter. And then the friend said, but you know what, if you can do this like 10 times a day or 5 times a day, then you make more money. And I know just the thing to make you do this. And he was introduced to tip. And so he becomes a drug addict. He then, obviously, being a drug addict and homeless, you'll get criminalized, and you will get caught at some point in time buying the drug or using the drug. And so he entered Baltimore at the age of 16 and came out of there not as a minor drug user, but he came out of there as a carjacker and a gangster. You know, he became a number. So that is what society is actually creating at this point in time, by not caring enough for the people that are, you know, falling into homelessness. And that is what our whole mission is not only do we want to reduce chronic homelessness, but we would like to prevent it from, for people from entering homelessness. And if they do for a very short period of time, like a week, for example. So the next section that I was asked to address was discovering new paradigms in making a pathway out of homelessness. Everyone should from the onset know that it is every homeless person's wish to be accommodated. This thing about the myths about homeless people not wanting to be helped is exactly that. It's a myth. There has to be a reason why a person would not want that as help. I spoke to somebody the other day and I said to them, you know what, you keep saying to me that they don't want to be helped because they don't want rules at shelters, etc. Now, those same rules that we are talking about at shelters, on the street, they become laws. And so whereas you're going to get a reprimand from your father or mother for doing whatever you're doing, maybe, you know, some parents might still smack you, but on the streets, you're going to get a criminal record and you're going to go to jail because you don't have a fixed address. And so you will spend 6 months in Baltimore if you are out on the street doing those type of things. So nobody would take that as a choice. Our group, for example, is a perfect example of a group that was given some agency. We started off in Strandfontein basically due to the terrible human rights violations that were being experienced there. There were so many things. By the 4th of April, I can't even name you all the things that were happening there. We approached the city of Cape Town. We had no intention of suing them. We approached them and asked them to please address their service providers, which they then said, you know, they're not prepared to do, and we're not going to dictate who their service providers are. And so started a movement that became known as SHAC, this Strandfontein Homeless Action Committee. And we won the case against the city of Cape Town. But despite having won the right to be accommodated after Strandfontein, the city still dumped us outside Kulenburg, which was going to be our home based on what they had said to us in court. And it was without the help of Community Chest, we would have sat in the rain that first weekend. There was a huge storm in Cape Town, and that's when Lorenzo Davids called myself and the chairperson of the committee and offered us their building. It was supposed to be for a day or two. It ended up to being 2 months. And during that period, everybody expected something horribly to go wrong, but nothing really went wrong. We took ownership and leadership. We were 3 leaders in the building, and we managed to get through the 2 months with no major. We had 8 evictions, and then at the end of that period, when Lorenzo said, you know, we need our building back in July, it was again the homeless leadership that organized the movement of those individuals into various facilities. Lorenzo had offered me an opportunity. One Sunday, he said to me, you know, I remember you telling me what you wanted to do in the sector prior to having become homeless, and I'm going to give you that opportunity. And so he provided the opportunity for 6 months. He was going to rent out a house where I could, you know, sort of manage the house and do it according to what I thought was going to be a solution to help homeless people. And cut a long story short, by the time we ended the project in December, we had a 70% success rate in actually, I won't even say in finding employment for them, because they actually found employment for themselves, but 70% of the individuals in the house were employed. And so not wanting to lose this, you know, you can't exactly take people up to that level and then just leave them. So that is how the Rehoming Collective came to be. We were trying to safeguard that. And that is where I need to make a point. When people are, and you know, I've been listening to learned people that have so many degrees and all sorts of things. I'm scared that these things become too intellectualized, and that we miss some of the major issues that we have when we are thinking about ending homelessness, taking people out of homelessness. We have to think about that process and how we're going to be supportive in that process. If you take that the cost of homelessness, yes.
Mr. Mesquita, so sorry to interrupt you. Your perspective is so valuable to us because you speak from experience, but unfortunately our Zoom session will end in 5 minutes. So I have to ask you if we can please, we are supposed to have another Q&A session, but what I will do is if I can ask you, Mr. Davids, if I can propose a challenge, if I can combine the 3 questions that we have and ask you if you can work your answer, your response to these questions into a closing for our session within 4 minutes, please. The first relates to the value of Ubuntu as opposed to the stark reality of the vulnerable citizens that we have, and then a different type of leadership that is required. Professor de Beer mentioned this, but how can we explore this further? What do we mean by a different kind of leadership? And I think you spoke to that earlier, so if you can please address that. And then also, how do we raise awareness among the fortunate youth about homelessness? They will be the next generation leaders who can maybe already get involved. We have 4 minutes, and then from my side, thank you to everyone, also our technical team, all our panelists, and everyone from the University of Pretoria, and all our guests. We are very grateful. I'm going to leave it to you, Mr. Davids, to close. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yolandi. I think what Mr. Mesquita said is so valuable, and as we bring this to a close, I think the practical examples of what, and I'm going to begin with the last part of this, of raising the next generation, of that awareness that exists within the new leadership that is coming into our space. We have to begin to talk about our challenges as a society as one, and conscientizing our children, our friends, our communities about the challenges we have within our civil society. And so we have to create spaces where people who live without shelter are within our circles. They are within our spaces. They are at our dinner parties. They are at our engagements where we sit in and do a meal together, or a walk, that we invite people into these spaces. it is fundamental that this conscious raising cannot be an artificial process. It has to be organic, it has to be natural, and it has to be inculcated into everything we do. If we keep putting the problem just outside the safety of our own sense of well-being, it will always remain there. It will never become integral to how we solve and address social problems. So that's the one. Second part is the leadership that's required, and I'll be very brief, is a leadership that is willing to abandon everything we know. And I say that in the most dramatic fashion. The fact that we say, when Carlos tells the story of me opening a building, an office block of 4 floors and a basement, and said to them, here's a building in the heart of town, in the most prime area of Cape Town in Bree Street. It's an office block. It's filled with equipment. Take it over. It was a risk. It abandoned everything. I had to abandon everything I knew. There were computers, there were printers, there were machines, there was office desks, chairs, clothing, the whole works was there. It was a functioning office. But I had to unlearn my own biases, my own fears, and say, no, these people will look after it. They will own it. They will take, and so they will take care of it. It is unlearning this thing that is keeping us all in the boxes we pretend we don't live in. So that's the leadership that is required. How much of what we know are we willing to unlearn, undo, and not do, and approach this process with all the risk indicators that tell us this is dangerous, and defying that. And Carlos gave back to Community Chest a building that was smarter, cleaner, and better than what we gave them to live in. And not a single thing was stolen. Not a single thing was stolen. Every laptop and computer and cable was in that building when they left, 180 of them. And finally is this notion of Ubuntu, this thing that I am because you are. So South Africans have this thing about, you know, it's the Rainbow Nation, it's Ubuntu, it's togetherness. We win a rugby match and we all go crazy for 2 weeks, and then we fight like heck to live apart again. We have this strange dichotomy within our society. This notion that I exist because the other person exists, I matter because you matter, or you matter because I matter. This thing that your existence is inextricably tied to mine is all cliche, but in practice it does not live. It does not live within us deeply, profoundly. And we have to find a way to give expression to that. And the most practical ways is that we begin to invite people into the room. It has to be that they're invited into every single space. The vulnerable, the poor, the marginalized, the drug addicts, the sick, the jobless, the homeless, they must be invited into the circle. If they are not invited into the circle, not invited into the room, not invited to write a chapter of a thesis, not invited to write a chapter in a book, not invited to contribute a video, if they are not invited, then we don't understand Ubuntu. Because then we are without them. We are not because of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Davids, and thank you to all our panelists from the Albert Luthuli Leadership Institute. Thank you to everyone for joining. And I think we leave this conversation with an expanded vision of what is required for us to move to the next level of what it means to be human and what it means to have human societies. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening.